Hello chess friends and welcome to Out of Chess channel and welcome to the last game of the match game between Magnus Carlsen and Maxim Vasilyev from the round 7 of the Magnus Carlsen Invitational tournament in 2020. Now it was Maxim Vasilyev that was playing with the white pieces. In the third game Magnus pulled off a great tactic, won the game against the Slav defense. Now Magnus chose to play this. Magnus played this Slav defense, and I think he found better ideas in the Slav defense as black. Let's check out what happened in the game. We have d4 played by Maxim, d5 by Magnus, c4, c6 the Slav defense, and after knight to f3 we have knight to f6, this modern line of the Slav defense, and now queen to c2, which is of course a delaying move a little bit by Maxim Vasilyev. One of the ideas of this queen to c2 idea is to restrict this bishop to f5 like Maxim played in the last game. But Magnus plays a very interesting line immediately. D takes c4. Okay, I'm gonna leave you this pawn central control, but you do that in order you make that happen by losing a tempo. So after queen to c4, I have g6, and here Maxim has maybe the opportunity to play immediately knight to c3. Which would be, I think, a good continuation with preparations to play e4. The importance about this move, if you, for instance, try here b5, then queen to d3, then bishop to f5, which Magnus played in this line, wouldn't be a possibility as it can be met with move e4. So after the move g6, Maxim didn't play this move knight to c3. He played the move bishop to g3 with preparations to play bishop to g2. And now after bishop to g7, we have bishop to g2, and now castling. And now Magnus pulls off this move b5, very aggressive, although you're leaving a little bit your c6 hanging. This pawn is really a dangerous pawn. And after queen to c2, we have now this move f5, and now you see the problem is you cannot make this e4 work, so that's why queen to d1. So Magnus has gained a couple of tempos, but still continuing the game with this weakness on c6, and that's why c5 immediately. If you take, for instance, d takes c5, then black has a comfortable game after knight to c6. After something like a3, in order to prepare some potential b4 moves, you could have this very great move knight to a5 with the preparations to play c4 after something like queen to d8, rook takes d8, b4. But now after knight to c4, the main threat is now to play knight to e4, so that's why it's very hard for white to protect the c5 pawn. So in the game, after the move c5, Maxim proceeded with its natural move knight to c3. b4, kicking away this knight, doesn't bring you so much as it can be met with knight to a4 ideas, attacking, and then maybe with some knight to e5 ideas with liberating bishops activity, and maybe attack this rook on a8. So that's why here in the game knight to c6 was played by Magnus, simply developing move. And here finally knight to h5, knight to h4, attacking this very annoying bishop with ideas to maybe finally to get our goal, this e4 move. But there is also a line, if you for instance try to pin this knight to unleash really this pressure here on the light squares, then I think we can even sacrifice the exchange. It's a comfortable game, it's a great game for black. I think after bishop takes a8, we could simply take queen takes a8, and now white has really some troubles on light squares. Bishop to h3 would be an idea with some even sacrificing possibilities on f3. White would be forced really to close the light squares with the move f3, but then this dark square bishop will come very active into the game. Still, we have also some expansion possibilities on the queen side, so I think Magnus would destroy here really Maxim in this particular line. So that's why after the move knight to c6, Maxim tried knight to h4, attacking this bishop, and now we have c takes d4, we have knight to f5, g takes f5. You cannot here take this knight, that's the problem, because you get knight to g7. You see, we will take another piece in between after something like rook to c8 in order to protect your knight. We would have simply knight to e6. Seems like a good move, I think. You're giving up back your piece, but at least you're creating new weaknesses in the position, and after that we can simply take b takes c3. I think with the bishop pair on the board, white has a comfortable game. So That's why after the move knight to f5, g takes f5, played by Magnus. We have bishop takes c6. It seems that Magnus has lost a piece, but it's not a problem, as this move can be met with rook to c8. Now two pieces are hanging, so knight takes b5. We have rook to takes c6, and queen takes d4, played by Maxim. So if you take this pawn on a7, it's very dangerous. Then your knight can be trapped. I think with move rook to b6, you don't have good squares for the knight to escape. In the next move, we could simply attack the knight, and I think this knight would be lost. So that's why in the game Maxim played queen takes d4. We have a6 attacking the knight. Queen takes d8. You have to trade off the queens if of course you retreat, and then the queen is hanging. It's not a possibility here for white. In this simplified line, Magnus basically forced Maxim to go into a drawer's position. Of course, Magnus needs only draw, as he won one game, so the result before this fourth round was +1 for Magnus, so he needs one draw to win this match game. So after rook takes d8, knight to a3, and now knight to e4, liberating this dark square, the bishop. It's very tricky now to proceed here. The b2 pawn is the main weakness in the game. Maxim tried king to g2, but now Magnus pull off again a great tactic. Rook takes c1. We have rook takes c1, and now bishop to b2. Knight to b1. If you try to hang on to your rook somehow, I think here really white has a comfortable game. You cannot play this move rook to b1, you get the fork, but even this rook to d1 idea, still this pawn storm that black has here in the center is okay. So that's why Maxim decided here knight to b1, bishop takes c1, and now rook takes c1. We have really a drawer's position, same pawns on the board. The rooks are of course in the game, so basically it's really a draw if no one makes any blunders. In the game, Magnus pull off rook to d4, very active move by the rook, trying to get this pawn on a2, which is the main weakness. In the game, f3 was played, knight to f6 by Magnus retreating, and now we have king to f2, rook to a4. You have to protect this pawn, so a3. And now Magnus played king to g7, which is of course very important in an endgame stage. You want to activate your king. Rook to c3, and now knight to d5. Simple threats that were played here by Magnus. We have rook to b3, and now rook to c4, knight to d2, and Magnus again with a simple threat, rook to c2, attacking the knight, keeping Maxim really busy here. And now knight to c3. We see how Magnus really finds the best squares on the board. Now he closed a little bit the rook. In the game, f4 was played, which is a tricky move here already, because you continuing the game with this backward pawn, and now our main target is somehow to attack the weak square on e4 here, occupying with the knight. So here first e6 was played, and now king to f3, and this was again a great move by Magnus. I think he played the move knight to e4, forcing basically here to lose a pawn. But now after king takes e4, he has the opportunity to take this pawn, rook takes e2, king to f3, and now he takes another pawn, and this is simply a better position here for black, of course, with the pawn up. But even if you go after this pawn rook to d6, it can always be met with rook to a2 ideas. We can always attack this pawn, but the main problem is that these three pawns are much more compact, are much better. The king can play much more freely in this potential endgame. So in the game, rook to d6 anyway played, and now Magnus pulled off a very important move, a5. He has really the opportunity to protect this pawn with rook to h5, so you see how Magnus uses the whole board. Very nice endgame technique, and now a4. So here rook to c5, keeping the rook very active with the pawn up. We cannot lose this game, of course, and as I said, Magnus needs only a draw. Rook to a8, and now h5. We have rook to a6, king to g6. We have king to g2 played by, but now king to f5. You see how Magnus sneaks in a little bit with his king. Here, after this move, rook to a7, which was sort of an inaccuracy played by Maxim, Magnus has, I think, the opportunity to play a better move, which he didn't make in the game. He has the opportunity to play the move king to g4. If here, for instance, Maxim takes, then we have rook to c2. You have to retreat here, and now we can take another pawn. It's, I think, much better this position for Magnus. In the next move we could also take this pawn, and the more important thing is that these two pawns are on the same rank, so we could also attack these pawns with rook to c4 ideas. So Magnus missed this. He played the move f6, which is also okay because he's still continuing the game with pawn up. In the game, king to h3, and now rook to d5. We have rook to a8, trying to get behind this pawn, playing the so-called Tarrasch rule. I mentioned it now many times. We want to go behind our enemy's pawns, so it's a very natural idea. e5, and this is really already a dangerous move now for Maxim, as Magnus can create a pass pawn. Very tricky. We want to, of course, create this pass pawn, as this king is a little bit far away from the center. That's why maybe this king to h3 idea wasn't the most accurate move by Maxim. Here we have f takes e4, and now rook to h8, attacking the pawn. Magnus defends it, and now rook to a8. So Magnus has the problem that all of these pawns are on the same rank, so he made simply here this move e4. The problem is for Maxim, you cannot basically attack this pawn with some rook to d8 ideas, king to f5, and the main goal here for black would be to play the move rook to e5, getting also, it's also the Tarrasch rule, getting our idea is to get behind our enemy's pawns, but it's also an idea to get behind our own pawns, this Tarrasch rule says, and now rook to e5 is a serious threat. Then this pawn could be really annoying, and that's why after the move king to pardon me, here after e4, king to g2 was played. You have to include this king into the game if you want to make some kind of a draw here. In the game, king to g4. It's very easy for Magnus to play, of course, this endgame. Here, rook to g8, now king to f5, now rook to a8. So you see how Maxim is staying behind this pawn. But now after king to f2, we have the opportunity to go much more actively into the game with our king to d4, and now king to e2. We have rook to g5. This is Maxim's problem. When you get with your king towards the center, then this pawn is loose, so it's a very annoying endgame here to play from white's perspective. You have to be accurate in order to make a draw. Basically, it's a winning position for black if black plays this game very accurate. So here, rook to d8, attacking the king to c3, and now going behind this pawn. And here Magnus played the accurate move, rook takes g3. After rook takes e4, we have rook to g4. It's not the best way here by Magnus. He shouldn't play this move, rook to g4. There is one problem about this move, because you're staying again with your pawns on the same rank. Maybe a better idea is to simply go after this pawn, waiting a little bit. Maxim also to do what, maybe king to b3 after something like, I don't know, rook to d4. We could go king to b6, or even try to defend this pawn. But in the game, Magnus pulled off this move rook to g4, and it allows now Maxim to go, you see, with his rook on a very active rank here. He attacks both of these pawns, and Magnus simply takes this pawn. Here king to f3 was played. Again, Maxim plays a mistake, which is now basically a winning game for black, because he has to take, I think, this pawn and try to get this king into the game. Maybe even king to d1 is a possibility. But in the game, he played king to f3, which is now, you see how far away this king is now from the action. But the problem for Magnus is that these two pawns are pass pawns on the A and H file, so these pawns have to be supported always by the king, and it's really hard to get this promotion working, because after rook to a2, Magnus restricts first this king's ability to play. King to g3, Maxim tries to go after this pawn, but now a4. Here in the game, rook to e4 was played by Maxim. Magnus simply attacks. Maybe again a better idea is to simply stay with the king and simply try to push your pawn further, because as I said, the king is too far from the action. Now king to d3, and Maxim pull off rook to f3, king to e3, rook to f3, and now king to e4, which was I think a little bit unnecessary for Magnus. Now the king is always an object of white's attack. White can always attack the king with some rooks. Rook to f4. You see again Magnus is retreating with the king. You cannot support anymore the pawns with the king. That's the main problem. After rook to b4, rook to a1, king to h2, and now a3. Very important move now to get this pawn's roll. But this is the idea by Maxim to get this king on this H file. It's a very important endgame technique. For instance, if the king goes maybe to the F file, one of the ideas of blacks is now to play A3, A2, and if white goes behind, I just want you to imagine the king's position on F2, then we can simply play, and then in the last move we could try a rook to H1. When the rook takes, for instance, the pawn on a2, then we could create this dangerous check on h2 and grab the rook on a2. So that's why Maxime plays with the king towards the edge of the board. Very important endgame technique here to make some kind of a draw. a3, rook to b3, and now king to d4. In the game, rook to f3 was played, and Magnus played simply perpetuals with the king. Again, we have some checks, and here after rook to b3, Magnus finally pushed his h4 pawn, but now rook to c3, rook to a2 was played, and there were a couple of perpetuals played here by Magnus Carlsen and Maxim Vachilagrov, and both of these players agreed to draw. You could make, I think, even a win here, somehow getting after this rook, trying to get our rook here on the b file, getting our king behind, but Magnus was probably satisfied with this outcome because Maxim Vachilagrov, of course, is the first player in this candidate tournament, so he is really a tough one to break, and Magnus broke him in this match game. He won the match game with 2.5 against 1.5. Great game. Still, Maxim, I think, played this slightly inaccuracies, got punished in the third game, lost the game. Magnus is now really the leader in this tournament. I don't think that anyone will catch up him, as he has to play still with Anish Giri, who has, I think, 0 points. I think Magnus will win this, but the others will play simply for the second place. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this match game. It wasn't maybe the best of match games, but I think from this day it was the most important one. If you want to see more games between Magnus Carlsen and Maxim, you can watch my previous video. Here's the link. And you can also watch my best chess games of all time if you want to see the best chess games that have been ever played in chess history. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.